Cuba is known as the Americans' playground. The U.S. had a huge investment in Cuba and were the owners of their banks and many of their farms. Many poor Cuban farmers who lived there were in poverty and didn't have the proper machinery to work on the farms. They also were without land. Cuba's economy relied on the sugar crop and only did well when sugar prices and demand was high.
The Americans have an air and naval base located in Guantanamo Bay, Cuba. Fidel Castro came to Cuba and built a revolutionary base. He educated villagers in his political standpoints and wanted their support. Castro built up an army of 300 men, which was enough to stand against Cubans trying to defeat him. Batista was defeated in January of 1959, and his government was overthrown in 2 years' time. The relationship between Cuba and America was broken because Castro wanted to fund Cuba instead of the Americas, and Cuba becomes communist.
The Soviet Union started to buy Cuban sugars instead of America. Cuba and the Soviets made an agreement that the Soviet Union had to buy 1 million tons of sugar a year so they could put their missiles on Cuba. This agreement helped Cuba get protection from American troops or attacks from America. The Russians also had to give a loan for 12 years to Cuba. JFK stated that the U.S. would not intervene in Cuba against their leaders.
Khrushchev wanted to succeed Stalin and become one of the Soviet Union's two leaders. Khrushchev challenged America's world domination and joined the space race. The USSR wanted to convince America that they wanted to live in peace. And on October 1962, America sent U-2 spy planes to secretly photograph nuclear missiles sites made by Russia in Cuba.
Kennedy increased America's defense money. A TV address issued October 22nd, 1962, where JFK notified Americans that there were missiles in Cuba and they would place a naval blockade.
Good evening, my fellow citizens. This government, as promised, has maintained the closest surveillance of the Soviet military buildup on the island of Cuba. Within the past week, unmistakable evidence has established the fact that a series of offensive missile sites is now in preparation on that imprisoned island. The purpose of these bases can be none other than to provide a nuclear strike capability against the Western Hemisphere.
Around the country, Russians began supplying Cuba with weapons and nuclear rockets. Bombs were also installed. If they were fired, they would reach the U.S. quickly. The U.S. would not be able to have any react time. Kennedy decided to place the naval blockade, or a ring of ships around Cuba. Russia was threatened by the naval blockade and that America was pushing them to a nuclear war.
President Kennedy sent U.S.-trained Cuban exiles to try to invade Cuba, but it was quickly stopped by Castro's forces and invaders were captured. This was called the Bay of Pigs. Cuban leaders said that if America promised not to attack Cuba and lifts the blockade, then they would talk about removing the rockets, missiles, and bombs. JFK agrees, and Russian ships returned home and disarms them, stopping a future nuclear war. JFK also secretly removed American missiles in Turkey.